I'm Elaine Reyes at the United Nations headquarters in New York, and this is UN Insider.
Coming up, UN officials conclude an internal investigation into the role aid workers may have played in the October 7th attacks on Israel. A look at the findings and what it means for the relief agency working to help Palestinians in Gaza.
When famine happens, it means we are too late. It means we did not do enough. It means we, the international community, have failed.
Urgent pleas for access getting aid to Sudan as the country faces unprecedented humanitarian challenges. And meet the creator of an app helping farmers weather the climate crisis in West Africa. Next.
The Middle East could be on the verge of a full-scale regional conflict. A series of violent exchanges, in addition to the killings of a key Hezbollah figure and Hamas's political leader, inflamed already roiling tensions. Iran threatened retaliation, and Israel announced it was engaged in a multi-front war. And now diplomats here at the UN are trying to pull things back from the brink.
I would like to make a special appeal to the international community to make a concerted effort to promote a ceasefire in Gaza as soon as possible, to ease tensions in the region as soon as possible, and to spare no effort in preventing further escalation of the conflict and confrontations which could lead to even greater casualties and catastrophe.
The international community, the world, has to answer the question of how much human suffering can be tolerated in the name of security. How many children have to be orphaned? How many elderly need to die? How many children need to be deprived of their childhood? How many civilians have to pay the ultimate price for it? The international community must help finding a path to peace and coexistence between peoples to avoid war, conflict, and generating suffering.
10 months of fighting have taken a devastating toll on Gaza. According to the Palestinian Territories Health Ministry, more than 39,000 people have died. Most of the population has been displaced at least once, and ongoing challenges for aid operations have led to a dire humanitarian situation. China recently donated $3 million to the United Nations Palestinian Relief Agency. The money will be used to provide humanitarian aid for the Gaza Strip. To date, the agency has received more than half of the $3.4 billion needed to meet the most critical needs in the enclave. From the Security Council to the briefing room and beyond, Shudeja is monitoring the latest developments inside the UN. Deja.
Yes, Elaine. August is a traditional vacation time for diplomats here. But just like what we called news dump, it's also a good timing for agencies to release reports or bad news to avoid media scrutiny. And this week, UN dropped a big one. OIOS report on the possible participation of UNRWA staff members in October 7th attack.
The Office of Internal Oversight Services has completed its investigation into 19 area staff members of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, regarding allegations of their involvement in the armed attacks of the 7th of October 2023 in southern Israel.
If you followed our segment, you'll remember that in January, UNRWA, the Palestinian Refugee Agency, issued a public statement disclosing that the agency had received from Israeli authorities allegations of the involvement of some UNRWA staff members in Gaza in the October 7th attack.
The Secretary General is horrified by this news and asked Mr. Lazzarini to investigate this matter swiftly and to ensure that any UNRWA employee shown to have participated or abetted in what transpired on October 7th or in any other criminal activity be terminated immediately and referred for potential criminal prosecution.
So, after the accusation, UN started two parallel investigations. One led by former French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna on the institutional performances. The report was released publicly on April 22nd. And here was what Madame Colonna had to say about the integrity of UNRWA. Can you just give us an idea how big of the problem is, you think? Do you think it's a systematic problem?
The problem is serious enough for the Secretary General to have initiated this review. So it is an existing issue, absolutely. Now, we've, at the beginning, and including at the beginning of this briefing, stressed the fact that the set of rules, the mechanisms in place, the procedures in place are probably, I said probably, but I'm sure I could say are the most elaborate within the UN system, precisely because it's such a difficult issue to work in such a complex and sensitive environment. Now, what needs to be improved will be improved. And I repeat, I'm confident that implementing these measures will help Iran delivering on its mandate.
The other investigation is the one we have this week, OIOS Office of Internal Oversight Service report. Sadly, this report is not for public, so we cannot read the whole report. Since the conclusion is that 9 UNRWA staff members may have engaged in conduct sanctionable under the applicable UNRWA regulations and rules, we were wondering what information OIOS has used to make this decision.
Visits to Israel for discussions with Israeli officials and to receive and review information held by Israeli authorities. Visits to Amman to obtain and review information held by UNRWA relevant to the investigation, including on UNRWA staff and on UNRWA operations. Review of information and communications technology data, including email records and information on UNRWA vehicles. Review of information received from various other sources, including that released through the media and other public sources. And communications with several member states to obtain any additional information relevant to the investigation.
And why may?
Since information used by Israeli authority officials to support the allegations have remained in Israeli custody, OIOS was not able to independently authenticate most of the information provided to it.
OIOS is not responsible for deciding what action will be taken once the investigation has concluded. And now, the OIOS investigation has been concluded. Any further actions?
Further action on this report, on this investigation, because you said it's been already concluded.
The OIOS investigation has been concluded. There may be further action taken, and we'll need to see how that is done.
Following the report, obviously Israeli ambassador to the UN, Mr. Gilad Erdan, criticized it too little, too late, and suggested that there were more cases. And here is the response from the UN.
He said, and I quote, the investigation ignored that thousands of agency employees involved in Hamas terrorism and the extent of their involvement. Israel has provided the UN with precise details of over 100 UNRWA employees who are members of the terrorist organizations Hamas. We didn't hear that much. We know that there are 19 people who are under investigation. What about the numbers here? Thousands of employees, 100 names.
What I can tell you is that if we are to get precise information, as the ambassador suggested, we will follow up on it. So we are willing to look into any precise information that is provided by Israel or any other authorities. If we do not have that, then there's nothing to follow up on.
Now, the thing is, Hamas was the de facto authority in Gaza. It's impossible for UNRWA to not have connection with Hamas to operate inside Gaza. It's just like what UN did in northwest Syria. And there are over 13,000 staff members of UNRWA in Gaza. 9 out of 13,000? Does that mean UNRWA is what Israeli Knesset called a terrorist group or collaborator with Hamas? Well, you draw the conclusion. And by the way, almost 200 UNRWA staff members were killed since October 7th. Well, at least with all 15 major donors that suspended funding after the accusation, 14 have resumed their fundings. US is the only one left. And that's all from me. Elaine.
Shudaja, thanks. In Sudan, more than 25 million people face acute hunger. That's more than half the country's population. Starvation and disease are taking a deadly toll. The World Food Program is boosting operations across the country, focusing on people facing emergency and catastrophic levels of hunger. Getting aid into the country has been challenging. Heavy rains have flooded the only routes aid workers have access to between eastern Chad and Darfur.
We need rapid, safe, unimpeded humanitarian access across Sudan through all possible routes. Given the massive hunger crisis unfolding in North Darfur and other parts of the country, we need to reach people now across borders, across battle lines, by air, by land.
An armed conflict has raged in the East African nation for more than a year, and there are also allegations of war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, particularly in the Darfur region.
The conflict in Sudan has lasted for 16 months. Every day the fighting continues. Civilian casualties and suffering will increase. China has always advocated that political settlement is the only viable way to calm the conflict and restore peace.
Let's take a look at some of the other issues on the UN's agenda.
Until there's peace, we need to increase the level of humanitarian assistance and focus especially on livelihoods.
The humanitarian response to Syria is facing a significant funding gap. UN officials say they've received roughly 20% of the funds needed for the year. Without increased funding, people living in hundreds of camps could lose water and sanitation services by September. Calls for a peaceful and orderly transition in Bangladesh. The prime minister resigned and parliament was dissolved amid nationwide protests. Weeks of unrest resulted in hundreds being killed and thousands injured. The UN says an independent, impartial, and transparent investigation is needed to help rebuild trust.
In recent months, regardless of the season, many countries have experienced surges of COVID-19, including at the Olympics.
The World Health Organization says COVID-19 is making a comeback. A surge of infections has been registered in the Americas, Europe, and the Western Pacific. Officials fear new variants could be on the horizon, ones that are undetectable and unresponsive to medical intervention.
Coming up,
people are dying because, some states and companies are taking away their lands and territories.
UN Insider.
Indigenous people account for just over 6% of the global population. There are an estimated 476 million Indigenous people spread across 90 countries. There are more than 5,000 distinct groups that may identify as Indigenous people. Every year, the UN marks World Indigenous Peoples Day on August 9th. The aim is to highlight the knowledge, cultural heritage, and traditions of Indigenous people, while acknowledging the ongoing struggles to preserve their rights as distinct groups. I sat down with Miriam Masakiza, a senior social affairs officer at the United Nations, who has worked on Indigenous issues for nearly 20 years. Miriam, thank you so much for joining us. What are some of the biggest and most urgent issues for Indigenous people around the world?
It's different from region to region, country to country, even between communities. But most of the issues that we have here at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues are land issues, territories, natural resources. People are dying because, some states and companies are taking away their lands and territories. Unfortunately, they don't have the proper access to services especially education, health, those are not culturally appropriated. And recently, very sadly, they are migrating not only to the cities, but to different countries. Indigenous peoples also are frequently killed sometimes. They are persecuted because they are defending their territories. So that's also very, very unfortunate. For Indigenous women, for example, also is very sad to see that because of these national companies are going into their territories, many issues like violence against Indigenous women, trafficking, also are affecting most of them.
You mentioned migration. We're seeing more and more urban Indigenous. Can you tell us a little bit about their move into cities and the specific challenges they face?
I think number one would be, as any individual, they would like to have, economic income, but this is related to the lack of opportunities in their own countries. So that's number one, that is, pushing them out of their lands and territories. And once they are in these big cities, they confront the discrimination, marginalizations. They are living not around the services that usually there are in the cities, but also they confront the loss of their languages.
One of the biggest issues of our time, of course, is climate change. What has been the impact of climate change on Indigenous communities, especially those with a lot of natural resources?
Indigenous peoples, they count around 476 million in some 90 countries. And they take care of around 80% of the most diverse places in the world. But they still protecting, they are, keeping all the environment as it is. And we can see a climate crisis that is not only affecting Indigenous peoples, but also the entire humanity. And they didn't contribute to that. So in this case, because they depend so much on their lands, territories, they are suffering more and more. Because when these companies enter into their homes, they are pushed away and they don't have a place where to go.
When you look across your work at the UN over the years and as a Quechua woman, what do you hope to accomplish and what are your goals for Indigenous peoples?
When I came to the United Nations, my hope was, of course, to learn what specifically this big institution was doing for Indigenous peoples, but also for the humanity, and especially how we are trying to find the ways to live together, because we have only one planet. I am very glad that at the United Nations, many milestones has been achieved by Indigenous peoples. Number one is the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. The second one, I would say, is the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. And of course, because of that also, there was an emergency of Indigenous languages. So in 2016, we had an expert group meeting that led member states to think about an international year of Indigenous languages. And now we are in a decade of Indigenous languages. So those, I would say, huge decisions adopted by the General Assembly show that at international level, Indigenous peoples became a key actor.
Marian Masakisa, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The UN has declared 2022 to 2032 the Decade of Indigenous Languages to draw attention to the importance of linguistic diversity. In the U.S., many Indigenous communities struggle to pass their languages on to the younger generations, the result of decades of forced assimilation in government-run boarding schools.
Across North America, the remains of thousands of missing Indigenous children have been found near the old grounds of boarding schools, like this one in Rapid City.
So today we are acknowledging the painful and often ignored history of boarding schools and residential schools. It's often excluded from history books, from curriculums, like people just don't learn about it. You don't hear about residential schools and boarding schools when you learn about U.S. history. And as a Native American person or an Indigenous person, it's been part of our lives. The shoes signify or represent the kids. Kids as young as 3 years old went into boarding schools, all the way through 18 years old. It's just really a visual representation. It's something for people to look at and to connect with the kids that you see now. It's just a way of visualizing that loss. The intention of boarding schools was to kill the Indian and save the man. It was deliberately meant to strip people of culture, of language, and it was meant to assimilate people into American culture. It was meant to detach people from their cultural identities, from their tribal communities, from their homelands. And that's why we are working so hard now to start unpacking those layers of what it's done, the effects it's had, and how we still feel those effects today.
You see when you're growing up there, so much cruelty, and the nuns were like authoritarians. I had a cousin, they caught her and they just whipped her till you can even count the number of times she was hit. You see a lot of things, I seen a priest, all the kids would be sent up there and he would grab certain ones and put them on his lap. And you would see him, but you would be touching him, And I always thought about that. I always thought about those little girls, and I don't know, I guess there was something in my brain that to protect, because I never ever went around him.
Roberta Kofi survived her boarding school. Some of her family members were not as lucky.
Could be diseases, we don't know. Could have been beat to death, don't know, Could have just been outright murder, don't know that either, All we know is that it did happen, And now it's coming to light, and I knew nothing about my culture, nothing. Because it's just like they took your mind. They didn't only just take your mind, but they took your soul too. And we weren't able to practice our religion. We weren't able to practice this way of life.
Roberta's great aunt died when they were teenagers at the school.
They didn't come until about 3 months after they were buried and told them that they had passed away. So, things like that happen, that you would lose your kids and they would bury them. You wouldn't even know about it. It's a process, and it's a long walk, I'm still not okay with it. I still get mad over my mom and the things done to our Native people. It just breaks your heart, But it's all coming out now, Secrets can't be buried forever.
UN Insider.
Whether it's about your education, the home you live in, or the items you buy, your money has a story to tell. Because every business story is a human story. Global Business.
UN officials say technology and innovation will play a key role in the next agriculture revolution. Part of that includes rethinking the tools farmers use to better adapt to changing weather patterns. Sean Calebs introduces us to the creator of a mobile phone app that helps farmers in sub-Saharan Africa with sustainable food production.
Nigeria relies almost exclusively on rainfall for agriculture. This leaves the country's farmers vulnerable to land degradation. Low crop yields affect not only the farmers, but also 70% of the Nigerian population.
The major challenge I've discovered for small-scale farmers in Nigeria has been irrigation and then poor inputs. Climate change is something that very, very unpredictable. And so poor reservoir facilities that could reserve water during the excess rain, and then also ability to recharge the farm during the drought. So lack of that knowledge, which are some of those things we are trying to bridge at Food Data, educating them appropriately, and also making available facilities that would help them. I want to welcome you all once again, and I also apologize for the weather. One of the things that we've been mentioning on the mitigating the effect of climate to avoid some of the challenges we had last year and then early this year with rain. So I don't know, are there any challenges we have with climate or issues that anyone wants to mention?
We have many challenges about climate. The rain is not start earlier. We farmers, we are request or appeal for irrigation, so that our crop and others will do better.
We've created an application that would help inform decision making. And one of the things we also look to get, which our extension agents will be using information on your planting, your timing, and then your weather and your seeds that were used. Because this will help us inform better decision on what to do and how to attend to you on that. Great farmer, no farmer, no nation.
Amos is traveling with his team to visit another group of farmers. While reviewing data, they realized the farmers didn't know much about climate change or existing solutions to the issues affecting their crops. They created an app that collects information from farmers, but also gives them access to alternatives to address some of the challenges they are facing.
We discovered that one of the challenges with smallholder farmers in Nigeria is data. Now, there is inadequacies of data to inform decision making. We took our statistics to find out what they know, and we discover they know little or nothing about some of the recent developments in the modern farming or smart agriculture. The app is one major solution in the data collection. So using this data that we collect in the community, even from the farmers and lobbyists, we forecast and predict future occurrences, what is to be and what is not to, and make viable decisions and suggestions and counsel that will help farmers.
I'm Elaine Reyes at UN headquarters in New York. Thanks for being a UN Insider.